So I think we can go ahead and get started.
Mm.
I just want to welcome everybody for joining us, and I also want to. I'm sure you saw the little thing pop up as you came into the room, but I want to alert you to the fact that we are recording. So we'll get started. We'll first hear some opening remarks from Professor Esra Ozurek.
Hey. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining. And yeah, at a time when we think Zoom meetings, we are fed up with it, still, it is effective. So I'm really happy to see so many faces and also so many little screens. So I am Esra Özürek. I'm the Sultan Qaboos Professor in Abrahamic Faiths and Shared Values, and I'm also the academic director of Cambridge Interfaith Program, which is hosting this um, launch. I am like Anastasia and Leah. I'm an anthropologist. Um, obviously work on interreligious encounters, and I am mostly interested in when one group embraces the beliefs and ideas of another. How and hence looking at intersections between race and religion. At the CIP, Cambridge Interfaith Program, we work to advance research in the field of religion, in particular in terms of the diverse, complex relationships between different religious traditions and between religious and secular traditions. We focus on global challenges, including an ongoing focus on religion, race, and inclusive societies, as well as religion and conflict. And we have a strong remit for interdisciplinary as well as research practice exchange and engagement. So we're especially pleased to be hosting this work on the materiality of interreligious encounters, which is not only innovative in its approach and reach, but also, I think, in its potential practical implications for interreligious relations and its futures. I've been following the development of this line of inquiry since the conference Anastasia and Leah convened in 2023. It was in person and it was so pleasant. And it has been exciting to see the momentum it has gathered and the conversations it has sparked, leading to this wonderful special issue. So without further ado, I'll hand things over to Anastasia and Leah to say a bit more about material approaches and introduce the issue.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Esra. And thank you, everybody, again for joining us for the launch of our Material Religion special issue, The Materiality of Interreligious Encounter. I'll just go ahead and share my slides. Oh, there we go. Okay. So this special issue emerged, as Ezra said, from a conference that Leah and I co-convened in 2023 in Cambridge. That conference and this issue really came out of our shared interest in the material, its potential, and the crucial role that materiality plays in religious lives. Before I say more, I want to first take this opportunity to thank the Faculty of Divinity and Cambridge Interfaith Program for hosting and helping coordinate this event. Thank you to Ezra for her wonderful support for the conference and this launch. Thank you to the Spalding Trust for supporting the conference. We want to thank all of our contributors for presenting really beautiful papers that made us realize we needed to find a way to get these amazing ideas out into the world. We're grateful to Katya Rakow and the editorial board of Material Religion, who were enthusiastic about putting together a special issue that emerged from our conversations, with special thanks to Andrew Coates, who guided us through the editorial process. Thank you to my co-convener, Dr. Leah Tarragon-Zeller, for her endless encouragement and enthusiasm.
And I want to stop for Anastasia for a second to say a huge thank you to Anastasia, whose brilliant friendship and scholarship and tireless efforts have really made all of this happen.
Thank you. And finally, a huge thank you to Dr. Iona Hine for her incredible and tireless work behind the scenes that made the conference and this launch possible. So we want to use most of our time together to hear some of the papers and hear from our contributors, as well as a response. But first, we'd just like to share a little bit about why we think this special issue is so important right now, and also to contextualize how we imagine this set of work can contribute to and foster scholarship at the nexus of materiality and interreligious encounters.
So scholars of religion have really powerfully demonstrated the need to attend to the material and embodied nature of religious experience. The journal Material Religion itself reflects and has been a key player in this turn, pushing back against earlier approaches focused narrowly on belief and text. Scholars have explored embodied practices and material engagements, showcasing the ways and context in which material things enable, induce, or support religious feelings. In a field that has long focused on privileging the intangible, the interior, and the believer, this body of work has convincingly illustrated the central role that material elements and sensational forms, as Birgit Meyer has put it, play in cultivating connections, belongings, and community across religious groups. It has also revealed the multiple stakes and commitments at work in religious lives, the processes through which public and political articulations of religion emerge, and the ways in which the affordances of material things powerfully shape, constrain, enable, and otherwise contribute to religious life. Kind of broadly, this turn has really helped us refocus our attention to religion as it is materially lived. But while most of this scholarship on religion and materiality tend to focus on one single group, this special issue engages materiality in the context of interreligious encounters. So some of the questions that we're asking is what might be learned by attending to the materiality of interreligious encounters? How do material elements, from buildings to food to bodies, enable interreligious relations, shape the texture of those relations, and facilitate respect, care, emotions, and many other things? So much like the study of religious life, research and practice related to interreligious meetings has traditionally been oriented around language, discourse, and especially dialogue. Yet this approach, and indeed interreligious dialogue as a practice, has been significantly critiqued in recent years for its focus on Christian interests and colonial logics, overlooking knowledges about religious diversity held by minoritized communities, and focused on kind of sharing stories over difference that can be exploitive of the narratives of those constituted as others.
Oh, there we go. In our introduction to this special issue, we argue that material things, spaces, objects, bodies, and beyond are critical actors in the production of interreligious encounters, religious difference, and religion as a category, experience, and way of being in the world. And we call for greater attention to the materiality of interreligious encounters as a countermeasure to address many of the incisive critiques of exclusively kind of dialogue-centered studies. Papers in this special issue demonstrate how attention to senses, space, time, and music can enhance our understanding of interreligious encounters, as well as offer fresh perspectives on the nexus of religion and materiality. Sami Everett's focus on music and museums as a means to call up and cultivate shared historical narratives across intergenerational Maghrebi Judeo-Islamic engagements invites us to consider the multimodality and temporality of interreligious encounters. Contrasting institutional and grassroots initiatives, Everett demonstrates that the ways in which music, museum exhibits, and other modes enable shared historical retellings, it is not a given, but that these hold the potential to surface reparative narratives and maybe instigate collective healing in a post-colonial French landscape. Lindsay Simmons' attention to the materiality of bodies illustrates the ways in which certain bodies come close and affect each other under particular conditions that, as articulated in political discourse, might preclude such bodily closeness in the first place. The Jewish, Israeli, and Palestinian bodies at the center of her study don't come near each other without frictions, but they often do so in ways that subvert or circumvent expected narratives, producing not only physical proximity, but sometimes the possibilities of easeful coexistence. Based on fieldwork with Muslims and Christians in Jordan, Hanan Benadi's showcases unique ways of thinking about climate change. She develops the concept of amana to go beyond global north discourses of climate change, outlining how people invoke different temporalities, values, and obligations in the present to live with the potential of future water scarcity. Building on ethnographic fieldwork on Jewish-Muslim dialogue in the UK, Yulia Egorova investigates how participants in one such initiative thematize the temporal dimension of anti-minority discrimination and perceive contemporary materialities associated with it. Focusing her analysis in particular on time, she suggests that narratives of positive historical trajectories in the minority experience sit alongside an anticipation of multiple possible futures, some inflected with anxiety about a repetition of difficult past, and others imbued with a vision connecting the past, present, and future of minoritized communities into a common present. Lastly, Erica Weiss examines Israeli-Palestinian peace initiatives, demonstrating the ways in which overlooking the material ideologies of structured encounter creates a disconnect that limits the possibilities for peacemaking before these events even begin. This insight offers analytical but also practical suggestions to pay greater attention to the aesthetics of structured encounters, which might support more meaningful reconciliation work, a really critical task, I think, at this painful moment in time. Finally, in the In Conversation section of our special issue, Birgit Meyer sets the agenda for a materiality-focused lens on interreligious encounters that takes, to quote Birgit, the in-between as the default and materiality as the prime angle to understand how people relate to each other. Responses from Ayala Fader, Vlad Namescu, and Jeremy Walton demonstrate how taking up the idea of the interstice can be valuable for studying Orthodox women in New York, a Catholic cathedral in Eastern Croatia, and shared moments of silence in an ashram in Kerala.
So in bringing a material lens to interreligious encounters, this special issue makes three critical interventions. First, going beyond text, which tends to privilege male traditions of knowledge production. Our attention to materiality enables us to surface the pragmatics of living together through sound, aesthetics, and shared resources, to name a few. Second, materiality draws our attention to proximities, past, present, and future, that are not articulated in discursive and politicized processes of religious differentiation. As narratives alleging eternal and inevitable clashes across religious difference become increasingly prominent, a refocus on shared material engagements helps us better see proximities and avoid reiterating politically articulated divisions, a really meaningful move at this moment in our contemporary time. Finally, attending to the power of materiality in interreligious encounters subverts certain forms of objectification and allows for a plurality of ideas about religion, religious lives, and religious interchange that goes beyond the strongly Protestant legacies that have long guided the institutional practice and academic study of religion. So looking at the histories of structured interreligious dialogue, as well as everyday interreligious meeting, shows us that we can see time and again a particular emphasis of religion that emphasizes belief, that assumes commensurability and comparability, and which is historically situated in a post-Enlightenment Europe. In addition, speaking to emergent scholarship on the material elements of interreligious encounter, this special issue suggests that a closer attention to the material might enable us to not only understand something new about interreligious encounters, but perhaps to also better support interreligious encounters. So what we would like to do now is share some of the beautiful papers that are part of this special issue. And if you have questions, you can put them in the Q&A, and we will get to that after our presenters have shared some of their work. So we're going to start with Birgit Meyer, who, as Anastasia showed us, wrote this beautiful In Conversation to stir some of the conversations in the special issue. So I don't think that you really need to be introduced, but I will say that Birgit Meyer is a professor of religious studies at Utrecht University, where she directs the research program Religious Matters in an Entangled World. And Birgit's work on materiality and religion has been foundational to so many of the works that we all do. We're so happy to have you here today, Birgit.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm really happy to be part of this special issue, which is based on a stimulating conference organized by the two of you, the co-editors at Cambridge University in September 2023. It included a number of compelling presentations about interreligious dialogues and encounters between, among others, Jews and Muslims. Hannah Arendt wrote, and I quote, "To live together in the world means essentially that a world of things is between those who have it in common, as a table is located between those who sit around it. The world, like every in-between, relates and separates men at the same time." After 7 October, just 1 month after the workshop, we have witnessed the grounds for the continuation of such dialogues being eroding or being totally erased through the Hamas attack and the harsh retaliation and destruction of Gaza by the Israeli army. Here there is no in-between, it seems, no table that relates and separates anymore. This makes me look back at the conference with a sense of despair, realizing all the more strongly how people's tacit, pragmatic attempts for engaging with religious others always depend on the will of the powers in place to allow them to happen. And I think that this power dimension must always be realized in our work, especially it can just put an end to the possibility of interfaith relations and coexistence. While I do not work in the study of interreligious relations as such, I certainly have a keen interest in studying religious plurality. The concerns of the editors and my own come together in the idea that materiality offers a viable entry point into how people with different religious affiliations and commitments relate. And it is nice to see that the idea also caught up with the participants and that this issue appeared just 1.5 years after the event in Material Religion. This journal, which I co-edited for quite some years, is a very appropriate venue, and I see the publication of this issue as part of the journal's attempt to spread its mission into the field, into a field so far little disturbed by the materiality virus. My contribution to the In Conversation section is titled In Between, Studying Lived Plurality from the Interstice. I was prompted to develop an interest in the interstice, in German the term would be Zwischenraum, out of a frustration about my difficulty to conceptualize religious plurality beyond an idea of religious traditions as neatly distinguishable entities, which each belong to the species of religion. Taking plurality and thus the in-between as the default condition and materiality as the prime angle to understand how people relate to each other in a convivial or conflict mode or just indifferently offers new possibilities for research. This opens up a common ground on which the study of interreligious encounters beyond dialogue intersects with a broader interest in dynamics of coexistence. From this common ground, interstice and materiality emerge as apt starting points for conceptual and methodological innovation. Following Georg Simmel, interstices are used spaces where different actors become aware of and relate to each other. So my point is that the notion of interstice is of great conceptual and methodological use to operationalize the political dynamics emerging between such elements across different kinds of religious and other boundaries, opening up a transforming and potentially creative space. As a unit for research and analysis, the interstice moves our inquiries to the level of lived religious plurality, through which actors encounter co-present others towards whom they position themselves and relate in multiple ways. In this way, a plethora of practices of coexistence across and between boundaries becomes visible. My piece is short and it cannot actually show the concrete outcomes or the benefits of the approach I'm trying to sketch. But I can refer here to an earlier In Conversation published in Material Religion in September 2022, put together by my colleague Samuel Tevuso and myself about modalities of coexistence in the multi-religious neighborhood of Medina in Ghana's capital Accra, that takes uses of space and food and practices around health and beauty as entry points into how people of quite different backgrounds relate to each other in an everyday, again, pragmatic manner. A focus on material forms and practices offers privileged insights into grounded encounters and negotiations of people's own commitments and preferences in relation to those of others. And this makes it possible to see practices of coexistence also in pianissimo, beyond interreligious debate, which, after all, is perhaps quite prone to demarcate and affirm differences. I would like to stress that in distinction to interreligious dialogue, coexistence is not meant as a normative project, but as a term that refers to plurality as a basic societal condition into which power structures are inscribed and affirmed as well as contested. The concepts interstice and materiality are meant to help us to conduct a deeper analysis of such plurality. And I'm very happy to see that the 3 essays in the In Conversation section take up some of my propositions for setting an agenda for a grounded material study of coexistence and offer inspiring ideas based on their research. Ayala Fader focuses on interstitial encounters between Orthodox Jews and Christians in the US, who share, notwithstanding very different theologies and positions in society, quite similar, illiberal, as she puts it, stances regarding political issues, including post-1960s positions on gender, family, and sexuality, as they are by now profiled once more by right-wing movements across Europe and also in the US via the Trump administration. She explores illiberal interstices evolving around wellness and health, in which Orthodox Jewish and Christian women can potentially find each other due to sharing similar stances vis-à-vis such societal issues. However, the actual occurrence of such commonality depends on the active mediation by religious authorities, and this is a very important point. A case in point here is the conservative Christian self-help book, The Surrendered Wife, that was, as she puts it, koshered, in quotation marks, by Jewish lifestyle coaches so as to be made acceptable for use by Jewish Orthodox women, yet was ultimately qualified as krum, seeming kosher without being so. What I find very interesting about this example is the role played by religious authorities in shaping the transfer of a book from the Christian to the Jewish sphere. A focus on practices this piece shows should not make us overlook the role of religious leaders in acting as gatekeepers that have the power to restrict exchange. Jeremy Walton, and I see he's also present here to my delight, in his essay on time and interreligious materiality, leads us to what he calls the sleepy Slavonian town of Dakovo in eastern Croatia, which is rather homogeneous with a strong Catholic hegemony. At first sight, in this post-socialist, post-Civil War city, coexistence across religious differences may not appear as a current issue, and yet it is there, enshrined in the most prominent architectural presence of the Catholic Church. It had a past as a mosque with a dome and tiles that is still inscribed in the building. Acknowledging the coexistence of difference in an iconic historical building decenters, he argues, self-legitimating narratives produced as part of interreligious dialogue or its rejection. This approach to coexistence understands a building like this church as a kind of time capsule that, in its very presence, also enshrines the past, thereby helping us to understand the conflicting history of religious encounters. While narratives are often loud, foregrounding the concreteness and solidity of built matter may unlock another story, so as to read how time is inscribed in space. And I think here of the German historian Karl Schlögel, and the title of one of his books, Im Raume lesen wir die Zeit. While a great deal in his piece, Silent Encounters, Vlad Naumescu finally opens up yet another dimension that comes to the fore when we look at interreligious relations from a material angle. While a great deal of attention in the interface dialogue usually goes to discourse, he introduces silence, writing about the Kurisumala ashram in India, which is, and I quote him here, a space of encounter between Eastern and Western spirituality. He observes that silence can bind people together in a powerful manner, regardless of their background and expectations. And of course, not respecting the silence then would become a highly offensive act. Keeping or making silence together is a highly important practice for fostering a sense of community that certainly is a crucial dimension that comes into view when we explore interrelations beyond talking occurring in a kind of Zwischenraum. Now, I find the 3 mini essays truly compelling, and it's a pity they are so short. They could certainly be developed into full-fledged articles. Taken together, I'm very happy that the dimensions of working on plurality as an interstice by foregrounding power, time, and silence can become apparent through these 3 wonderful essays. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Birgit. I think your notion of the interstice really provoked so much fruitful discussion at the conference, and I know thinking afterwards. And your work on materiality really, I think, provided the frame for this whole discussion. So thank you so much. So yeah, just to remind everybody, we'll save questions for the very end, but please feel free to note them in the chat as we go along. Next, we will hear from Yulia Egorova. Let me just see if I can pin her. There we go. So Yulia Egorova is a professor of anthropology at Durham University in the UK. Her research has focused on issues in the study of minority identities in relation to public discourses about race and religion, and in the context of science and biotechnology. And her current projects explore the experiences of Jewish and Muslim communities in the UK and initiatives in interfaith dialogue. So take it away, Julia.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Anastasia and Len. Again, thank you for inviting me to take part in this book launch as well as in the initial symposium, which I certainly greatly enjoyed and learned a lot from. So I will be very brief and will just speak about the paper for a few minutes. I'm building currently on the work that I've presented in the paper, so I'm certainly very open to questions and protests and the more general discussion. So what I presented in the paper is, in fact, a piece of my ethnography building on that larger study that you've just mentioned. And it's a study that has altogether lasted, for scary to think, about 10 years, where I've been following one particular initiative in Jewish-Muslim interfaith and intercommunity dialogue in the UK, as well as conducting interviews in different parts of the country with activists of Jewish-Muslim dialogue. And focusing on that particular initiative, I would attend meetings of the group, which would normally take once a month, once every couple of months. And what I describe in the paper is a visit that they make to Lincoln. And again, it's sort of their standing event, as once a year they would normally go to a city somewhere in the UK, and a city that would be significant in terms of the role that it played in Jewish and Muslim histories of the country. And again, more broadly in my body of work, I'm focusing, well, like a good anthropologist, on one particular initiative, but in the larger scheme of things, my interest is in the examples of solidarity and some of the kind of more subtle and silent examples of solidarity. So in that particular episode that I describe in the paper, we go to Lincoln, and the purpose of our visit was to established contacts with the Interfaith Initiative in Lincoln, but the bulk of the day is taken up by a Jewish heritage tour where we're taken to Lincoln and shown artifacts pertaining to the Jewish heritage and medieval Jewish history. And I'm sure as many of you would know, what Lincoln is known for is the richness of its medieval history, but also the history of the presence of Jewish communities in the Middle Ages. And so we were taken to Lincoln Cathedral and then shown around the city. And what I found striking is the way the artifacts, the material artifacts pertaining to Jewish heritage and medieval Jewish history, which unfortunately index severe cases of anti-Jewish violence, including blood libel, were received and responded to by my interlocutors, by members of the same of this group, where I could see that both Jewish and Muslim participants in the group were quite surprised and taken aback by seeing artifacts pertaining to Jewish history and not being discussed critically, or just being there without any further explanation that would be kind of materially visual right there. So what I'm trying to do in the paper is describe these episodes, but also discuss them against the backdrop of some of the work that has been conducted in anthropology of time and temporality, including some of the work that took place in my own department here at Durham, or with colleagues such as, for instance, Felix Ringelo, Elizabeth Birgit and Bob Simpson, inviting us to pay attention to the political dimension or political and social dimensions of the way our interlocutors or individuals in general construct and perceive their temporalities, and also the importance of paying attention to the way our experiences in the present very much inform and shape the way we perceive and understand what is known these days as heritage, or including the material artifacts of historical heritage. And I'm now, again, just to finish with a disclaimer that this is certainly my very first foray in heritage studies, and I'm now trying to build on this work by conducting a collaborative study together with the Manchester Jewish Museum, where we conduct focus groups and interviews with heritage specialists, just members of Jewish communities in Manchester and more broadly who have an interest, either personal or professional, in presentations of Jewish heritage, to establish what they would see as examples of good practice in these representations, and in what ways they would prefer for Jewish heritage to be represented, well, more broadly, but particularly in England. So I think that I would now stop here, as my 6 minutes have elapsed, and I would very much welcome questions. Yeah, thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia. I'm so excited to hear about how this project continues to unfold and sort of where it goes next with this new collaboration with the Manchester Jewish Museum.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. So here we go. Next, we will hear from our contributor, Sami Everett, who is a senior research fellow at the University of Southampton and a Mera Institute for Advanced Study, Aix-Marseille University. His research focuses on the historical, colonial, and spatial political dimensions of North African Jewish and Muslim identification. Trained in political and cultural anthropology, he has a degree from INALCO Paris in North African language and culture. His work is located between North African, Middle Eastern, Jewish, and Islamic studies of diaspora, dynamic interreligious encounter, and interaction and migratory trajectories. So Sami, take it away. I think if you have some slides, I think you should be able to share them now.
Okay, no problem. Yeah, so I just wanted to reflect on the article that I submitted by way of a little vignette of a vignette almost. So this was kind of predicated on a visit that we conducted to Pantin Cemetery, which is in the northern part of Paris. It has a significant Jewish part to the cemetery, many of whom were from Northern Africa. And we conducted the walk within the Festival for North African Jewish Cultures in 2023 in May. It was just around the time of the Hilula, a pilgrimage that's quite a famous pilgrimage in North Africa. It's a Jewish pilgrimage, but it also has Muslim participants, and Muslims also visit the same grave sites. And it was conducted, like I say, in May 2023, so it was before the world fell apart, and rain tapped gently against our umbrellas in our small group that was huddled together. The weathered gravestones seemed to listen as we spoke about Renette Lohanez, who was born Sultana Daoud, her journey from blindness at age 2 to becoming one of the greatest voices of Andalusi music was quite incredible. In tracing her bibliographic arc, I felt the weight of history and the promise of the future as I stood there, researcher, raconteur, academic, pilgrim, heir of a Maghrebi Jewish family from Western Algeria, like that of Renette. Jacqueline Gozland stood by me near the gravestone plot, her filmmaker's eyes having seen 2 generations before what mine could not. Renette performing Nehebbek, Nehebbek, I love you, I love you, during her final Radio Alger broadcast, the symbolic farewell to her beloved Algeria. We spoke of how Renette's voice had become a cultural bridge in the 1980s for the French North African Marche pour l'égalité, March for Equality, her blindness and marginality somehow making her music a more powerful vector for intercommunal connection. She was always placing songs at symbolic moments, Jacqueline said, her voice barely audible above the now quite heavy rainfall. Nehibbek, during her last Radio Alger session, it was her way of communicating ghorba, that profound sense of exile. With us stood a father and a daughter who had just returned from Tunisia's Ghriba pilgrimage, the Hilula that I mentioned. They had been trapped inside the synagogue during an attack that killed 4 people. Their silent presence connected our cemetery visit to larger patterns of trauma and resilience across the Maghrebi Jewish diaspora. Once we'd finished talking, an elderly man with a weathered face stepped forward from the group and began reciting the mourner's Kaddish over Renette's grave, his voice unsteady but resolute, carried through the light rain. He passed his hat around afterwards, rich and poor Jews sharing space above and beneath the ground, as has been the custom for generations. Later, I shared the playlist that I'd compiled of Renette's songs with voice notes from those who cherished Renette's music, even today. And I reflected on the animated films that Imiskil and I had created around Renette and Mustafa, her beloved pianist from Algiers, and his fingers playing those Andalusi melodies that transcend religious boundaries. Like our work on the zouj, the duos, the tandems, Bashtarzi and Yafil from Algiers, Susan Qasantini from Constantine, we try to capture the essence of intercommunal creation through sound and visual means, the shared cultural heritage that defies neat categorization into Jewish or Muslim. At the end of the visit, a young veiled woman from Morocco approached. She was studying Hebrew at Dalala, an association, an organization that I'm involved with that provides language classes in Hebrew and Arabic. She was drawn by the organization's logo, the Hebrew script Alif Lem, Alif Lemed, denoting the Arabic article El, a symbol of linguistic and cultural interconnection. She wanted to know more about Renette's music, its connection to Andalusi traditions, the ghorba, and the melodies that run like a current. So I'd just like to show a few of the images from the article, if that's okay. This is a picture of Renette with Mustafa standing just above her. So Renette always wore those shades. As I said, she was blind from the age of 2, but she was a musical maestro, a ma'allima, as they say. And Mustafa Skandrani went on to become head of the Conservatoire of Algiers after independence. Renette was exiled in northern Paris, and her days ended in the late 1990s, and she was relatively little known, in fact. And I transcribed the lyrics of Nehebik Nehebik above, so we can see the Arabic on the left-hand side and the English on the right-hand side. And here you see the kind of connection between this exilic literature from the medieval epoch and the connection with the exile from Northern Africa in the mid-20th century. And then just one more that I'd like to show you, which is an image taken from the Cairo Geniza, which exists virtually in Cambridge University Library space. And this is an extract from Dalalat al-Ha'irin, Moreh Nevuchim, which is Maimonides, the Rambam's famous text, the guide for the perplexed. And this is written in Judeo-Arabic script. These are some of the materialities that I've mentioned in my little talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sami. That was a really lovely vignette, and I think it really gives us a view into precisely what Birgit described, this notion of coexistence and exchange as really a social condition, a lived reality, kind of negotiated around and through these very material presences. So thank you so much. So unfortunately, we were meant to hear next from Hanan Benadi, talking about her contribution to the issue Divine Trust, Amana, and climate change in Jordan, valuing water in the face of water scarcity. But she was in the meeting earlier, but I understand has had some technical difficulties and has been unable to rejoin. So I think unfortunately we won't be able to hear from her today. But please do check out her article. It's really wonderful. She's doing some really interesting work. And I think she is actually in the field at the moment, which may be part of what's going on with the tech issues. So in that case, I think we will skip ahead to our response from Professor Jeremy Stolow. Professor Stolow is Professor of Communication Studies at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada. He is the author of the wonderful book Orthodox by Design and has recently published a new book, Picturing Aura, a visual biography. His really seminal work on materiality, I think, has been an inspiration for this work, and I think also a crucial contribution to the study of materiality in religious lives and the anthropology of religion at large. So thank you so much, Jeremy, for joining us today, and we really look forward to hearing your response to this special issue.
Thank you, Anastasia. People hear me okay? Yes? Okay, good. Yes, I'm delighted to be at this part of this conversation, but I have to say it's somewhat humbling. I wasn't part of the conference. I come to this topic as well as an outsider. I really have no expertise in interreligious and interfaith dialogue. It's a body of scholarship and an arena of pedagogy and practical work that I much admire, but really don't speak as an insider. So it's quite humbling to be called upon to comment on work like this. I really found the entire issue very educational for me. It was a lot of pleasure to read it and to think about some of the issues that are in hand. So it's my job as the commentator to try to think a little bit more collectively about what's going on here, both sort of the promise of a collection like this, what kind of assumptions are being carried through some of this work, and where it might go further from here. And I hope in that spirit, these comments that I have come up with, some of which now I'm wondering whether I would have revised it, having heard others speak. Too late now, but so let me just try and muddle through a few thoughts that I hope are helpful to everyone. And I guess the problems with the title Materiality of Interreligious Encounters are only three problems. What do we mean by material? What do we mean by religious? And what do we mean by inter? So I want to start at the risk of some semantic play to just reflect for a moment on these terms and what kind of work I think they're doing, both individually in some of the pieces, but also in the collection as whole. And I think one of the things that probably motivated this collection, and I certainly think it is a commonplace agreement in a lot of work that both appears in the journal Material Religion, but amongst us here gathered today, is sort of a now deeply seated understanding in religious studies that there's a huge problem about making assumptions about the existence of a discrete bounded object that we call religion, which is somehow tied together with distinct discursive traditions, institutional structures, and communities of committed believers, as if there's these simple countable nouns we discover everywhere in the world called religions. Among other things, as I think this collection especially highlights for us, it's quite a task to even imagine contemplating something called religion that exists outside of or in isolation from other dimensions of social life, or for that matter, from other religions. There's no such thing as a single isolated object called religion. And instead, as Birgit puts it in her own conversation piece, that we really are called upon to take plurality as the default, sort of the starting point for analysis, rather than an occasional observation that might come afterwards. Or an exceptional situation that somehow stands outside the primary tasks of observing, describing, and analyzing these discrete communities and traditions. And that's something I very much agree with and have tried to pursue in my own work in various ways. And just as I don't think there's any way to conceptualize life outside of plurality, I don't see any way to study religion that doesn't begin with a fundamental and inescapable condition of plurality in some way or another. And incidentally, it struck me, although it's not made as explicit in the title or in some of the commentary to date, it's also especially striking to note that the particular examples that are drawn upon and discussed at some length here are all monotheistic religious traditions. So we're talking about the Abrahamic strands of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in one iteration or another, which happen to form the empirical basis of this collection. This is, I think, perhaps a particularly powerful test case for thinking about these questions of plurality, especially given their long histories of rhetorical rejection of other cosmologies such as polytheism, animism, monism, and other forms of practice and belief that are in one way or another considered inauthentic, heretical, or problematic. And so I'm wondering, sort of what happens. One of the things I like about the collection is its specificity rather than trying to capture everything, but it does make one it does raise some questions for me about how do we move from the more specific discussion of engagements among these particular monotheistic groupings to these larger considerations of what interreligious encounter might mean. But I do think that the great strength of this collection is that it really does demonstrate in different ways how these fundamental conditions of plurality have methodological consequences, how we need to shift our attention to margins and boundary spaces that that sometimes give us as scholars and as everyday observers and maybe as practitioners the illusion that every religious community somehow has a kind of singularity and an internal coherence that can be examined on its own. Interreligious encounters are the scenes of plurality in extremis because they throw into such sharp relief. There is no such thing as isolated purity. We're always in a condition of plurality. And that leads me to wonder what role the term inter, the prefix inter, plays in this discussion. And of course, there's a multiplicity of possible relationships that are being fleshed out by this term. And I think that the collection really sort of shows us this in some detail, whether we're talking about exchange or trade or dialogue, coexistence, cohabitation, mimesis, adaptation, appropriation, differentiation, métissage or mixing, competition, complementarity, domination, resistance, refusal. These are a whole sort of set of possible ways that we might conjugate this notion of in interreligious encounter. And it makes one sort of wonder whether the same kinds of whether there's a complementarity or a translatability from one of these particular forms to another, and whether and how we would undertake sort of comparisons. I think perhaps, sort of the gauntlet has been thrown down in some important ways by Birgit, not only in previous work she has done, but in this short conversation piece where she calls upon us, and I want to sort of emphasize the precise wording of her formula. She asks us, how do people relate to religious others through material forms? And this word other, I think, raises some specificity and calls upon us to think more specifically, not just about plurality per se, but about some kind of process of othering, of a process of differentiation that is always at work in these quote unquote encounters. And this makes us think about in between as the in between space as an object of focus, not just as a spatial category that happens to be animated by different relationships and actions, but also thinking about otherness in terms of its power dynamics of religious differentiation. And this is something I think that Leah and Anastasia also really draw attention to and emphasize with their mobilization of the word minoritization and their emphasis on questions about dominance and minority, or dominant and minor forms of religious encounter, as is cashed out in so many of these articles as well, where we are in fact talking about unequal relationships of exchange. And I think that raises for us important ways of thinking about religious coexistence and cohabitation. And material religion or material studies is, of course, the key variable here that so many of these articles are doing this, admirable work of helping us think through how it is that in different religious traditions, different assemblies or assemblages of humans, things, gods, and spirits, as Birgit puts it, come together in these interstitial places where one and the same object, for instance, or practice can be articulated very differently, whether as a shared resource, a medium of exchange, or a tool or an object that somehow becomes amenable or repurposed among these different actors to different ends. Anastasia and Leah call upon us in their introduction to highlight the ways in which material things, spaces, and also bodies do this kind of work. And this, of course, is not only a great contribution to the journal Material Religion, which has had it as its long-standing goal and mandate to try to think beyond the dominant theoretical approaches in religious studies that focus on belief and propositional claims, meaning making in ritual, and sacred literatures, to thinking about these other actors and factors. And it's quite striking the range of additional sort of players that are brought onto the stage in this particular collection. We're introduced to buildings, shrines, museums, cemeteries, meeting halls, relics, historical artifacts, commemorative plaques, recorded music, animated film, multimedia installations, digital toolkits, environmental resources and infrastructures, such as those that pertain to water resources, body practices such as handshakes, gestures, and even the placement and orientation of bodies in these moments of encounter. And that's the great richness and beauty, I think, of this collection, is that it adds to our empirical base for thinking about how religions and religious activities are materialized, but also thinking in particular how each one of these objects becomes presents a kind of opportunity for thinking about encounter, exchange, competition, minoritization, and all of the dynamics are at stake. But since the task falls upon me to try to say something in response to the very admirable work that's already been undertaken here, beyond sort of simply saying how much I enjoyed it and that it's great contributions, I wanted to sort of end with a few reflections that occurred to me of some things that left me wondering in some of these cases. I'm struck in particular by the strong sort of human-centered focus in the activities of symbolism, meaning-making, imagination that really threads through so much of the collection here, as opposed to questions that might focus more on some of the non-human actors, or at least provide more sort of richer detail of things that get passed over rather quickly. And so just to give a couple of examples of what I'm thinking about, and again, I really want to emphasize these as sort of marginal contributions to what is already very robust literature. I think it's rather lazy for commentators to only talk about what's missing from an article rather than talking about what's there. And I really mean these in a spirit of trying to think through the categories that are at work rather than complaining about what authors might also have done. But let me just give a couple of examples that occurred to me that is sort of by way of sort of closing off my comments here. Hanan Benadi in her article paints a very detailed portrait of the way Jordanian Muslim and Christian actors address problems of water conservation through this concept of amana, which operates both sort of temporally and morally as a horizon for ethical action in the face of climate change. But at least as far as her study is concerned, we don't hear very much about infrastructures or techniques of water extraction use themselves. Their material costs, the legal questions about legal ownership, how water conservation is actually navigated in relationship to other actors who may not be involved in questions about its ethical implications and so on, let alone the natural resources of the rivers and wells and water tables themselves. And these all kind of recede into the background of an analysis that focuses on this kind of moral horizon of appropriate action. In a not unsimilar gesture, Yulia, in your paper, you focus on discursive, symbolic, and also affective dimensions of this memory work in the analysis of the Little Hugh Shrine at the Lincoln Cathedral. But we don't get a great deal of attention on the details of the shrine itself, on its material and spatial organization, on the work of maintenance of these sites, and other kind of dimensions that might somehow lie underneath this more discursive account of the way in which the sort of particular version of the past is mediated in these engagements of Jewish and Christian visitors to the site. And I'm wondering what would how the focus of this analysis might shift, even if only very marginally, if we were to bring into play here questions about the physical organization of the space, the techniques of display, or some of the non-verbalized movements of bodies through these spaces. Would they end up supporting the account that people give discursively of their memories or and their concerns, or would it somehow contradict or undermine or point to other ways of thinking about people's relationship in those spaces? Lindsay Simmons in her beautiful piece on proxemics, and I would put this in, it's quite striking. I don't know whether this was intentional or not, but how much overlap and collaborative spirit it is with Erica Weiss's text, which both sort of address some of the ways in which Israeli, Jewish, and Palestinian encounters are orchestrated in terms of their physical spaces, in terms of material objects such as tables and chairs and staging elements, but also the sort of orchestration and organization of bodies in movement, and the ways in which particular sort of gestures such as handshakes or orientations are organized to sort of play out these forms of encounter and undergird support, but also in some dramatic ways that come out of the analysis also can not only support but even undermine some of the attempts at interreligious reconciliation, such as in Erica's description of the ways that, who gets to decide what an appropriate meeting space looks like, sort of reinscribe some of the power dynamics that the very meeting is supposed to overcome. But what also falls out of the analysis are some of the other more sort of mundane sort of actors that are also at work in this encounters. So for, among other things, the very last photograph in Lindsay's article, which presents a portrait of these two women who are whose faces are coming somewhat closer together, and is sort of presented with us as a kind of an account of the ways in which the proxemics of these actors orient themselves bodily in ways that their discourses do not address. It also leaves out of the analysis, however, the fact that there's a camera at work here, that these are people posing before the camera for a photograph, and it inscribes them into this long history of portraiture and raises all kinds of questions about the work of the technology itself as a medium of representation, but also the iconography of portraiture itself, which positions these actors in particular ways above and beyond their discrete sort of strategies, their own bodily strategies in that particular space. It's quite striking, not only that they bring their heads together, but they also point themselves towards the camera. They're presenting themselves to be pictured. And I could go on further with other examples, and I already probably have exceeded my time. So let me just say in closing here that my point is not to complain about what's missing, but to incentivize us to think about some of the various actors who also populate these arenas of interreligious encounter: photographers, musicians, artists, digital content designers, event planners, architects, maintenance workers, police and security agents, not to mention all of the non-human actors such as cameras, digital platforms, chairs and tables, and so on, that also are at work in these dynamics of religious encounter. And that seems to me to sort of raise a kind of a methodological problem for us in the whole mandate of material religion studies, but also in particular, this question of interreligious encounter is, at what point do we decide to stop the analysis because these things are no longer relevant to the study of religious encounter per se? And where and how do we draw the line between saying like these things are supportive or they are in some way relevant to the encounter, but they don't shed any light on the interreligious dynamic per se. And I think that this is something that all of the articles in one way or another trouble us with and force us to think about in some productive ways. But I imagine that the work is ongoing, and we will need to continue to reflect on ways that we might locate this boundary line, not simply between religions, but between the things that we call religion and the things we assume fall outside it. So I'll stop there with, again, my thanks to all of you for the provocation to think about this and the wonderful work you've done.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. I mean, there's so much food for thought in there. I think especially this idea of how and when and where do we sort of draw the line in terms of attending to non-human actors is super thought-provoking. And I think something that we could all consider, in sort of revisiting our articles in the special issue. And I think just a bigger question for us working in the study of material religion overall. So thank you so much for those amazing insights. And we have a bit of time now for questions. So feel free to either pop something in the chat or raise your hand. Yeah, and we can have a bit of a conversation.
While people are thinking, I just want to briefly say, and Lindsay, I saw you. Well done for being quick. I just want to add in on the thanks. Jeremy, I feel like you've given us much food for thought, and also you've really like given us strings that we can continue working with, and thinking about the human, non-human, the focus on the Abrahamic, which was very specific to this one, but obviously we could do much more than that. And I also want to go back to what you said at the beginning, which I thought was extremely important for us here, and perhaps for some of the people here as well, about the plurality of religion, which is always there as well. So now that I've given people some time to think about questions, Lindsay, why don't you go first? And if anybody has questions and wants to write them, please do so. And if not, just raise your hand.
Thank you, Leah, and thank you to everybody. Been wonderful, wonderful for me morning in New York. I just wanted to just ask Birgit actually during her presentation, she gave the example of the surrendered wife and the kind of both maybe appropriation, misappropriation, shared, in a sense, shared sense of authorities imposing their understanding of whether this is an appropriate piece of literature to be read within certain conservative, one imagines, communities. And I was just thinking about the gendered nature of this experience. And given that my research has been very much about women and so on. So I just wondered in general if you felt that this space, the interstices, the sense of the word inter that we have, held to account today, what your thoughts are about that.
And you put the question to me, right? Yeah.
Yes, but
well,
yeah.
Of course, I just try to bring out what I really learned from Ayala Fader's piece. And I found it very interesting because at the back of my mind, I have a case studied by Kauthar Khamis in our Medina project. It is also about Muslim and Christian women and their exchanges in relation to being beautiful, so that their husbands will not leave them or don't take a second wife or something, which is an issue for both. And I think they are going quite far in advising each other and also taking certain products that may be seen as magical and so on, stuff from Nigeria, stuff from the whole realm of indigenous knowledge and so on. And I think they do so very much in secret, often unknown to their husbands, and certainly at some distance from the church and the mosque, where you also have certain programs, marriage lessons, and so on. But among these women, I find quite a preparedness, or Kauthar Khamis found, to just do. So in a way, the church and the mosques are wide. And I found it interesting how in the case Ayala analyzed, it seems that the qualification of a Christian product, which in certain ways, I think, as she showed, accommodates Orthodox Jewish perspective, still ultimately depends on some kind of koshering. And so she has this example of this one rabbi who said, no, it looks kosher, but it isn't. So just stay away from it. Of course, women may still read it, but I found it interesting to see this kind of intervention. And it alerted me to pay perhaps more attention also in our case, what comes from the imams and the pastors. But, and so I think this is just a very, very interesting thing to consider. And yes, you are very right. So this is a very gendered phenomenon. Women somehow struggling to do well in their lives, often under very, very unequal gender relations, and having to face, in a way, not only what husbands expect, but also then what religious leaders expect. And I think we are well advised to see how they strategize and which materials they find okay to mobilize in the pursuit of at least some degree of empowerment. So that's how I would take it. But I was really, really interested. And it's a pity, again, that Ayala does not expand on the case and is also not here. So I'm not really in a position to say more about her case, but I found it very compelling, and yeah, so that's what I could say about it.
Thank you.
And may I say one other thing? I very much liked Jeremy's discussion, and I also very much appreciate your last point, Jeremy. And I think that the wish to, in a way, include the material dimension, if you say it in a very casual way, has to do with realization that it is not enough to focus on symbols, rituals, all these ideas communicated through language as such, and then extrapolate meanings and so on. So there is somehow a very strong awareness that this is not sufficient to capture these very complex dynamics of interreligious dialogue. So I think the turn to materiality comes out of a kind of Unbehagen and a wish to do otherwise. That is one thing. And I think all the papers in a way show this. At the same time, to really develop another method and go much further in materializing our approaches is the second thing. And this is also somewhat difficult. And of course, there are several options to take. So you could leave it and say, okay, I will now take into account the material culture of a particular religious encounter context. You can also, and that's fair enough. And I think it is already important. I also think that you are right that perhaps this could have been done more. You could, of course, also say, no, I also want to develop a kind of new epistemology or perhaps ontology that drives me very far into new materialism. Or I may not do that and still remain as I do somehow in a neo-phenomenological way, because I believe we still need to have some space for these ideas. Ideas, of course, always have bodies. Indeed, Lindsay, I think, makes that also a very clear. Meaning making appears, but it is gendered, it is embodied, it is material. But somehow I always want to not throw away one in favor of the other. But I think the simple question you raise about methodology and how far to go, where to draw lines, leads us into very big theoretical debates, which line in a way in this whole trend of taking much more seriously materiality one would take. And I would say by and large, I'm very much on a kind of material semiotic line, indebted to Latour and so on, but not quite in the new materialist line, because that for me becomes too ontological. I do not want to make ontological statements about how humans, culture, society is enmeshed with the material. I still want to have an eye for the specific, for these still cultural or phenomenological life worlds in which we all act. But this is a very, very big issue, maybe also time for a conference or something to discuss. But I'm very happy you thematized it.
I think we have a full new research agenda. Anyone who would like to respond, ask someone a question, if any of the contributors would like to ask each other a question, please feel free.
Just to respond very briefly to Jeremy about the materiality of the shrine. Yeah, thank you, Jeremy, for this comment. It really is an extremely important point to make. Just didn't have I think an opportunity to expand on that side of the description of the shrine. So I went a little bit more down the historical kind of rabbit hole. But yes, you're absolutely right. The question of the material organization of actually the so-called shrine, well, historians suggest that technically it's not a shrine, but it acquired its image, at the moment really gives it the rather negative agency, because on the one hand, in fact, the shrine itself does not exist, so it was destroyed during the Reformation, but its site still exists with a tombstone of whoever they think was Little Hugh. And the materiality of that site is such that it's just very hard to extract it from the building of the cathedral, which certainly raises question about in what ways it could be maintained differently or presented differently if to take away or dilute that negative agency. But yes, I think also the question about the maintenance is definitely something that is very important to look into and that I'm definitely going to do, to see what kind of action and resource actually goes into maintaining something that the cathedral leadership themselves have indexed as a very, very troubled heritage. Yeah, so thank you for this comment.
Vlad?
Hi everyone, it's really nice to see you and thank you for, I came a bit late, I couldn't come in the beginning, but I think I didn't meet, I missed just the beginning. So I wanted to thank Lea and Anastasia for putting this together in the beginning and also Birgit with the keynote. I think it was a really inspiring, you can't show it in a very short text, the one I produced, but it was really inspiring and there's a lot to think about. I just want to follow up on this idea of materiality for a moment, because one of the things that really excited me in terms of like thinking through these interreligious, the encounter part of it, interreligious encounters, and also the question of coexistence, which is more of a commitment than the actual encounter, is the fragility of this. There's two things actually. One is the presence, the idea of presence, which inspired me and not just me. I think Lindsay's and Erica's, like all these contributions were really about presence, and how you create a presence and how present is there. And I just wanted to make this like to bear like naked almost. So a silent presence is kind of the most limited one, if you want, and because it really, you have to acknowledge someone's present there. So I think that I really, this dimension that came out in the conference was really interesting for me and not just for me. I think, and the other one is the fragility of the encounter itself. And I think here materiality becomes interesting, right? Because when you have on the one side, you have there's a temporality to it, which is really like very, very precarious in a sense. And there's also a sort of the actual moment of encounter, and thinking about it, for example, like I was wondering in this kind of the materiality, the sites, right, as a materiality of the sites, are they a prerequisite for an encounter? And this is something that I was thinking also when writing my own, but also like in Birgit's own example, is it a prerequisite for having an encounter? So creating these spaces. And we have a long history in anthropology of thinking and debates on thinking about shared shrines, right? So places of encounter that are there and afford this kind of relations to form, but also create certain tensions, and they are also fragile in their coexistence, in coexisting in them. Or are they a result? And of course, this is a chicken and egg problem, but it's part of, I think, what makes them interesting in the same time, and what makes us the dynamic, like following this dynamic and the processes interesting for us as anthropologists. So these were just two thoughts that I had while thinking about your, and also Jeremy's, the interpart, and also Jeremy's comments. Yeah, thanks again.
Jeremy?
Jeremy.
Just, I guess, a very marginal thought here in relation to some of these more methodological concerns. I very much agree, Birgit, with your concern about sort of what kind of status do we want to give to materiality in a kind of an analysis. it begs, I think this is where sort of people trained in religious studies, have a great advantage, as we can recognize that, sort of new materialism is itself a cosmology, that it is also a way of construing and imagining the world. And it makes me think again, sort of the specificity of this collection, that, I think is quite appropriately entitled Interreligious Encounters and Not Coexistence. And Birgit calls upon us to think about this distinction, between a sort of a normative project that's aimed at mutual recognition or resolution of some sort of difference, justice, peace building, solidarity, and so on the one hand, and coexistence as this much larger sort of condition, which is inscribed in power relationships, which could be marked or unmarked, which could be arguably, the fate of our human condition in everywhere, in all circumstances, is one of coexistence. But encounter, etymologically, the word encounter always sort of has this adversarial dimension to it. It has the word contra in its roots. So there's something about the word encounter which inscribes a kind of a relationship of opposition, of one body to another, of one person to another. So we're getting closer to the kind of dynamics that, Lindsay also comments upon in her book, that are not only discursive, but they are performed, they're bodily, they're gestural, they're lived in all of these various ways, and they're materially inscribed, as Yulia shows us in, these shrines are not simply places where people inhabit, but they are places of display, and they have a rhetorical function, to incite certain kinds of memory work, or to cultivate certain kinds of devotional relationships, where differently positioned actors sort of are placed in this contra position in one way or another. And so maybe more could be done with the sort of specificity of what this tradition that some of you come out of, working in interfaith and interreligious dialogue, have to offer, for the ways in which we might think about a particular subspecies of coexistence that really is concerned with these questions of dialogue, of explicit engagement with one another. I don't know if that's helpful or not, but it does seem to me to be, one of the strengths of the piece is that we're not talking about all forms of cohabitation or coexistence, but a very particular set of them that are highly self-reflexive very often, because even in sort of some of the everyday participants who talk about, in Sami's case, these sort of this lost world, where Jews and Muslims were so deeply intermeshed with one another, and the kind of memory work and nostalgia and heritage that's connected to these things. These can be sort of thought of as performing some kind of interreligious encounter work in the context where people recognize, what has been lost, and what are the circumstances that people find themselves in today that are so very unlike that. And so this kind of memory is about, not just about the facts of this mixing, but it's about its status, its political and memory work status in the present, under conditions where something has been lost, and painfully so.
Birgit.
Thank you. I like your reflection, and I just want to say I'm of course not up against the term encounter. I often use coexistence, but what I would differentiate between is a more normative project of somehow making people relate to each other in a positive way, which I find fair enough. I mean, there is a lot of need for that. But I would say it is very important to, before embarking on that, do perhaps a more cool analysis of the forces at play. And I have come to talk about plurality, coexistence, and I think encounter could fit in there very well as a very specific modality of that. But then I would separate that from a more normative project, which of course is often with interface initiatives. And again, I'm not against such initiatives, far from that, but I draw a distinction between also the theoretical work that goes into these more normative interventions, and perhaps the more, kind of somewhat cooler, documenting analytical analysis, which of course ultimately can also be seen to have a normative dimension as an outcome. For one would really pay a lot of attention to analyze specific minority-majority situations, in particular hegemonies, and so on. So I just want to clarify that I'm not against, I'm not sure you meant to say that, but I'm not against using encounter. I've also used it, and I think it's indeed a specific, a term that is very, very useful for the kinds of, let's say, Begegnungen in German that stand central in this issue.
Not to cut off the discussion, but just keeping an eye to the time. We are at the formal end of our launch today. So I will stop the recording here.